In the polished corridors of power, silence is rarely an absence of noise. It is a language of its own, a currency more valuable than any stock option. It can be the quiet hum of ambition, the stifled cry of injustice, or, most dangerously, the patient, calculating breath of revenge about to be unleashed. For in the world of gleaming glass towers and billion-dollar deals, the loudest threats are not shouted in boardrooms, but are born in the profound, overlooked silence of a soul that has been wronged. This particular silence began on a Tuesday evening at the annual gala of Archstone Consulting, a place that sold strategic futures to the world, but often mortgaged the souls of its own people. Champagne flowed, and the air buzzed with forced laughter and the clinking of glasses, a symphony of corporate self-congratulation. On stage, bathed in a soft spotlight, stood Marcus Thorne, the CEO. He was a man sculpted from charisma and razor-sharp ambition, with a smile that could sell a doomed company and a voice that made promises feel like destiny. Tonight, the company was celebrating a record-breaking year, a feat made possible by a single, revolutionary project known as Chimera. In the crowd, Alara Vance stood perfectly still, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Chimera was her blood, her sweat, her ghost. It was the product of 18 months of sacrificed weekends, of dinners gone cold, of sunrises seen from her office window. It was the masterpiece that Marcus had promised would be her ascension, her key to the locked door of the partnership. She could almost feel the weight of the new title, the culmination of a life spent believing that hard work was its own reward. Marcus's voice boomed through the speakers, praising the project's architect for their unparalleled vision and relentless dedication. This was it. The world seemed to slow down, every eye in the room a heavy weight. Then, Marcus smiled that predator's smile and delivered the final, fatal blow. "And so, it is my distinct honor," he declared, pausing for dramatic effect, to announce Archstone's newest partner, the brilliant mind behind Project Chimera, Mr. Liam Carter. The name struck Alara with the force of a physical impact. The applause that erupted sounded distant, like waves crashing in a far-off storm. Her gaze snapped to Liam, her best friend, her confidant, the man who had brought her coffee on those sleepless nights, who had listened to her fears and celebrated her breakthroughs. He was on stage now, shaking Marcus's hand, his face a perfect mask of humble pride, a mask that couldn't quite hide the triumphant glint in his eyes. He had stolen her work. He had stolen her future. And in that moment, as the celebration roared around her, the vibrant noise of the party faded into a deafening, profound silence. A new kind of architecture was being designed in the ruins of her heart, not of strategy, but of retribution. And it would be built stone by cold, silent stone. To understand the architect of a grand revenge, you must first understand the world that broke the builder. You must walk through the quiet corridors of her past, see the foundations of her character, and feel the immense pressure that was placed upon her, day after day, until the inevitable cracks began to form. Before she was a force of nature, Alara Vance was the company's bedrock, the silent, unassuming foundation upon which the glittering careers of others were built. She was born not into the world of legacy admissions and summer homes in the Hamptons that many of her colleagues took for granted, but into a quiet, middle-class neighborhood in the Midwest, a place where hard work was a virtue and integrity was the family crest. Her father was an engineer, her mother a librarian. They taught her the value of precision, the beauty of knowledge, and the unwavering belief that merit, and merit alone, would clear a path for her in the world. This belief became her compass, her true north. She excelled, not through networking or charm, but through sheer intellectual horsepower. She graduated top of her class, her mind a finely tuned engine capable of seeing patterns in chaos, of turning mountains of raw data into elegant, actionable strategies. This was her ticket to Archstone Consulting, a golden key to a kingdom she thought was built on the same principles she held so dear. She was, of course, tragically mistaken. Her only anchor to that simpler, more honest world was her grandfather, Arthur, a retired history professor with hands that smelled of old books and pipe tobacco. He was the keeper of her conscience. Their weekly phone calls were a ritual. While Alara spoke of market projections and synergy, Arthur would speak of Roman generals and Renaissance artists, of figures who faced betrayal with dignity and who understood that true power was not in the title on a door, but in the strength of one's own resolve. History has a long memory, Ilara, he once told her, his voice a warm, steady rumble over the phone line. It forgets the noise of kings and the boasts of conquerors, but it remembers the architects, the builders, the ones who created things that lasted. It was a lesson she held close to her heart, a quiet mantra in the cacophony of corporate life. She poured that philosophy into her work, treating every project not as a task, but as a legacy to be built with care and precision. At Archstone, this dedication made her an anomaly, a creature of a different species. The office on the 54th floor of a Manhattan skyscraper was a meticulously designed jungle. Its inhabitants were polished predators, masters of social maneuvering and political warfare. They spoke in a language of buzzwords and veiled threats, their smiles calibrated for maximum effect. They viewed work not as a craft, but as a performance. It was about being seen at the right meetings, about laughing at the right jokes from the right senior partner, about crafting emails that expertly shifted blame while claiming credit. Into this world walked Ilara, who believed the work should speak for itself. And because her work was brilliant, she was not fired. Instead, she was utilized. She became the firm's ghost, its secret engine. She was the one who would inherit a project when it was on the brink of collapse, handed a mess of incoherent data and a panicked timeline by a slick consultant who had spent more time on the golf course than on the analysis. She was the one who would stay until 3 a.m, her face illuminated by the glow of her monitor, meticulously rebuilding the flawed models, rewriting the nonsensical slides, and finding the single, brilliant insight that would save the client and make the project lead look like a hero. The process was always the same. A colleague, often Liam, would approach her desk with a troubled look. "Ilara, you have a minute? I'm hitting a wall with this." A minute would turn into an hour, and the hour would turn into Ilara, essentially taking over the core of the work, her mind too eager to solve the puzzle to recognize the pattern of exploitation. Her reward was a quiet, "Thanks, Ilara. You're a lifesaver," whispered so no one else could hear. The next day, she would sit silently in a meeting and watch that same colleague present her slides, her analysis, her words, to thunderous applause from Marcus Thorne. She was doing the work of 3 analysts, yet her name was a footnote on an internal memo. Marcus, a master of psychological manipulation, understood her value and her vulnerability perfectly. He cultivated her like a prized, hidden orchid. In their rare one-on-one meetings, he would shower her with just enough praise to keep her motivated. "You're my secret weapon, Ilara," he'd say, leaning forward with conspiratorial sincerity. "The others are all flash. You're the substance. You're the real deal. Just be patient. Your time is coming." He made her feel seen, even as he ensured she remained invisible to everyone else. He fed her the dream of a partnership, a seat at the table she so richly deserved, all while using her as the intellectual fuel for his entire division. She was the workhorse pulling the golden carriage, convinced that if she just pulled a little harder, they might eventually let her ride inside. This was Ilara Vance before the betrayal, a brilliant, tireless, and tragically naive builder, laying stone after perfect stone for a cathedral that, she was about to discover, would never bear her name. Every tragedy of betrayal requires at least 2 villains, though they rarely wear the same face. There is the one who wields the knife, whose actions deliver the sharp, immediate wound. And then there is the one who steadies the victim, who whispers words of comfort and assurance, ensuring they remain perfectly still for the coming blow. At Archstone Consulting, these roles were perfected by 2 masters of the craft: Marcus Thorne, the charmer who promised the world, and Liam Carter, the serpent who called himself a friend. They were the architects of Ilara's ruin, and their partnership was a masterpiece of corporate depravity. Marcus Thorne was the sun around which Archstone revolved, or at least, the blinding spotlight he had carefully constructed to look like a sundae. He was a man in his late 40s, perpetually dressed in bespoke suits that cost more than Ilara's monthly rent, with a full head of silvering hair that suggested wisdom rather than age. His greatest talent was his voice, It was a finely tuned instrument capable of inspiring a room of 1,000 people with visions of market domination, and then, moments later, lowering to a near whisper in his office, making a single employee feel like they were the most important person in the world. He spoke of Archstone as a family, a meritocracy, a place where the best and brightest could thrive. But his definition of best had little to do with talent and everything to do with utility. He saw his employees not as people, but as assets, each with a specific function. Some were workhorses, some were show ponies, some were political assassins. His job, as he saw it, was to deploy these assets for maximum profit. Alara was his most valuable asset, his nuclear option. He recognized her genius from her first day, but he also saw what he perceived as a fatal flaw: her sincerity. She lacked the ruthlessness, the killer instinct he believed was essential for true leadership. In his mind, she was a brilliant tool, not a hand worthy of wielding power. So he created a gilded cage for her. He would call her into his expansive corner office with its panoramic views of the city and close the door, a gesture of manufactured intimacy. "The presentation you built for the Sterling account was a work of art, Alara," he would say, his voice low and confidential. "Liam did a fine job presenting it, but we both know who the real brains of the operation island. Don't worry about the noise and the politics out there. Just keep doing what you do. Your work is what matters, and I see it. I see it all." He was validating her core belief that the work was enough while simultaneously ensuring it would never be. He made her a promise of a partnership, a vague, shimmering destination on a distant horizon, a mirage he could move further away whenever she got too close. He needed her mind, but he could not afford to give her a voice. If Marcus was the distant, commanding general, Liam Carter was the spy in the trenches, the agent of friendly fire. On the surface, he was the antithesis of the typical Archstone shark. He was quick with a joke, remembered people's birthdays, and always seemed to have a sympathetic ear. He became Alara's shadow, her work confidant. He learned her coffee order, her professional anxieties, her personal hopes. He positioned himself as her only ally, the one person who understood the pressure she was under. Their desks were side by side, and their late nights at the office became a routine, fueled by takeout pizza and a shared sense of being in it together. It was a meticulously crafted illusion. Beneath the warm, affable exterior, Liam was consumed by a corrosive blend of inadequacy and envy. He had the right pedigree and the social graces to get hired at Archstone, but he lacked the raw intellect to keep up. He saw the ease with which Alara deciphered complex problems, the effortless elegance of her strategies, and he hated her for it. It was a quiet, seething resentment that he disguised as admiration. His method of thievery was insidious, a slow, patient poisoning. It began with small requests. "Hey, Alara, I'm stuck on this financial model. Can you just take a quick look?" A quick look would invariably become Alara finding the fundamental flaws and rebuilding it from scratch. He would then present the flawless model as his own. He mastered the art of intellectual osmosis. He would invite her for a coffee to brainstorm, which was his code for letting Alara map out an entire project strategy, which he would diligently type into his phone as his notes. He'd ask for her draft reports for inspiration, only to copy and paste entire sections, changing just a few words. He was a professional parasite, and Alara, in her trusting nature and her genuine love for solving problems, was the perfect host. She saw it as helping a friend, as collaboration. She never imagined that he was not just taking notes, he was building a case file, a complete portfolio of her intellect that he would one day claim as his own. The two men had an unspoken pact. Marcus knew Liam was not a visionary, but Liam was loyal, not to people, but to the hierarchy. He was a perfect soldier for a cynical king. He had the political savvy Alara lacked, and he was willing to do the dirty work. Marcus saw in Liam a reflection of his own ambition, unburdened by Alara's inconvenient integrity. By promising the partnership to Alara while grooming Liam to take the credit, Marcus was executing what he believed to be a perfect corporate strategy, motivating his best worker while promoting a loyal, controllable subordinate. The charmer had found his leading man, and the serpent had found his path to the throne. Both of them knew that the success of Project Chimera depended entirely on Alara's mind, and both were united in the silent, ruthless agreement that for them to rise, her name and her contributions had to be completely erased. It began, as most corporate epics do, not with a bang, but with a problem. The problem's name was Innovate Dynamics, a titan of the tech industry that had grown fat and slow, and was now bleeding money, investors, and relevance. It was the kind of client that senior partners at Archstone avoided, a corporate carcass they were ready to leave for the vultures. But where they saw a dead end, Alara Vance saw a hidden door. In the labyrinth of their financial reports, in the tangled mess of their inefficient supply chains, she saw a pattern, a ghost of a revolutionary idea. The solution wasn't to trim the fat, it was to perform a heart transplant. Her idea was radical, complex, and audacious: to merge three seemingly disparate divisions of the company into a new, symbiotic entity. It was a strategy so unconventional that she named it Project Chimera, after the mythical beast of many parts. She brought the proposal to Marcus Thorne in a meeting the rest of the firm had already written off as a formality to terminate the Innovate Dynamics account. The air in the boardroom was thick with expensive cologne and cynical resignation. One by one, senior managers presented data that confirmed the company was a lost cause. Then, it was Alara's turn. She was just an analyst, a junior presence in a room of sharks. But when she spoke, the room fell silent. She didn't just present numbers, she wove a narrative of resurrection. With a calm, unwavering voice, she dismantled every argument for failure and, with each slide, laid a new brick in the foundation of her visionary plan. She had anticipated every question, modeled every risk, and forecasted a future for the company that no one else had the imagination to see. Marcus Thorne, a man who prided himself on his ability to spot a winning horse, leaned forward. He saw the genius in the plan, but more importantly, he saw the opportunity. The risk was enormous, but the potential glory was all-consuming. "All right," Marcus declared, cutting the meeting short. "I'm greenlighting this. Chimera. I like it." He turned to the room, but his eyes settled on Alara. "Vance, this is your baby. I want you leading the deep dive analysis. You'll be the architect." Then, with a casual wave of his hand, he added, "Carter, you'll be the project lead. Handle the client interface, the communications, the politics. I want Alara completely focused on the strategy. Give her whatever she needs." It was a masterstroke of manipulation, presented as a gift. He was freeing her from the distractions of management, he said, so her brilliance could shine. In reality, he was putting his politically savvy pawn in charge of the messaging, ensuring that the man who spoke about the project would ultimately be seen as the man who created it. Alara, blinded by the opportunity and the trust she thought Marcus was placing in her, saw only the mission. She finally had the chance to build her cathedral. What followed was not work. It was a total immersion, an 18-month siege. Alara's cubicle transformed into the project's war room, its walls papered with process flow diagrams, financial charts, and handwritten algorithms. Her life shrank to the dimensions of her computer screen. Sunsets and sunrises became interchangeable blurs of orange and gray, seen through the sealed windows of the 54th floor. The hum of the office servers was her constant companion. She lived on lukewarm coffee and the adrenaline of solving impossible problems. She was the sole architect, designer, and builder of Chimera. Every projection was hers. Every line of the strategic framework was hers. Every risk mitigation plan was hers. Liam's role as project lead was that of a glorified assistant and a meticulous thief. He managed the logistics of Alara's obsession. He ordered her meals, he scheduled the meetings where she would present her findings, and he acted as the sole gatekeeper of information flowing to Marcus. His days were spent watching her work, a shadow at her shoulder. "Walk me through this model again, Alara," he would say, his brow furrowed in feigned concentration while he was secretly memorizing her logic. "Can you send me your draft of the executive summary? I want to make sure it aligns with the client's comms strategy." He would then take her drafts, reformat them, put his name on the cover, and forward them to Marcus with a note that said, "Here's the latest thinking I've developed. It's starting to come together." He became an expert translator, converting her genius into his own political capital, one stolen insight at a time. Throughout this grueling marathon, Marcus played his part perfectly, dangling the ultimate prize just within reach. He would forward her an email chain praising the project's progress, with a simple, private note added to the top. "They're all impressed, Alara. But I know it's you. The partnership is waiting." When he saw her looking exhausted, he'd stop by her desk with a paternal smile. "Don't lose steam now. This project is your ticket. I've already told the board to keep a seat warm for you." These calculated words were the fuel that kept her going. They were the validation she craved, the proof that her sacrifice was not in vain. She trusted him. She trusted the system. She even saw Liam's role as a necessary evil. He handled the schmoozing she despised, freeing her to do the real work. She saw them as a team, each playing their part, never once suspecting that she was the only one who didn't know the real objective of the game. Finally, after countless sleepless nights, it was done. Project Chimera was a triumph. Innovate Dynamics was saved, and Archstone had secured the largest contract in its history. The final report, a 200-page testament to Alara's singular brilliance, was complete. She felt a profound sense of emptiness, but also a quiet, fierce pride. She had done it. She had built her cathedral. She had no idea she had built it as a tomb for her own career. The night of the gala felt like the final scene of a long and grueling film. The air in the grand ballroom of the Mandarin Oriental was thick with the scent of success, a cloying mix of expensive perfume, gourmet food, and the electric hum of 100 self-important conversations. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a glittering tapestry of the Manhattan skyline, a kingdom of light that seemed to promise that anything was possible. Alara stood near one of those windows, a glass of untouched champagne in her hand, feeling like a stranger in her own skin. She had bought a new dress for the occasion, a simple, elegant sheath of dark silk. It was an act of faith, a quiet investment in the future she had been promised. After 18 months of living and breathing Project Chimera, the exhaustion had settled deep into her bones, a permanent ache that sleep could no longer cure. But beneath it all, a fragile, persistent spark of hope flickered. Tonight, the sacrifice would be given meaning. Tonight, her name would be spoken. The clinking of a glass against a microphone silenced the room. Marcus Thorne walked to the stage, moving with the easy, predatory grace of a man who owned every room he entered. The spotlight found him, carving him out of the darkness, and he began to speak. His voice, that smooth, persuasive instrument, washed over the crowd. He spoke of challenges and triumphs, of market headwinds and corporate resilience. He was a conductor, and the emotions of the room were his orchestra. Then, he turned to the topic of the evening, Project Chimera. "There are moments in the life of a company that define its future," he began, his voice dropping to a tone of reverence. Moments of such profound innovation and daring that they become the stuff of legend. Project Chimera was such a moment. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. It was more than a turnaround strategy. It was a paradigm shift. It required not just intelligence, but a rare form of courage to look at a dying giant and not see an end, but a new beginning. He was using her words, quoting directly from the preamble she had written for the final report, a passage she had labored over for days. The small theft felt like a needle prick to her heart, a minor wound before the fatal blow. Ilara's breath caught in her throat, her knuckles were white around the stem of her glass. This was it. "A project of this magnitude is never the work of one person," Marcus continued, "but it is always driven by one singular vision. And the architect of this victory, the leader who guided this ship through the storm, deserves to be recognized at the highest level of this company." He let the silence stretch, a masterful piece of theater. The entire room held its breath. Alara's heart was a deafening roar in her ears. She could feel the stares of her team members, a heavy, expectant pressure. She straightened her posture, ready. And so, Marcus's voice boomed, a smile spreading across his face. It is my distinct honor to announce Archstone's newest partner, the brilliant mind behind Project Chimera, Mr. Liam Carter. The name was an explosion, a soundless, devastating detonation right in the center of her soul. For a single, frozen second, her mind refused to process it. A mistake, he misspoke. He meant to say my name. But then the room erupted in thunderous applause, a wave of noise that slammed into her, and the illusion shattered. She saw Liam, 2 tables away, rising from his seat, his face a perfect portrait of feigned shock and humility. He hugged a colleague, clapped another on the shoulder, and began a slow, triumphant walk to the stage. He moved like a man stepping into a destiny he had long rehearsed. Alara's world tilted on its axis. The glittering skyline outside the window seemed to blur and swim. The faces of her colleagues morphed into grotesque, smiling masks. She watched Liam take the stage and shake Marcus's hand, the 2 of them beaming for the company photographer, a perfect picture of mentor and protege. Then Liam leaned into the microphone. "Wow," he said, laughing a little. I'm speechless. I mean, where do I even begin?" He started with the expected platitudes, thanking Marcus for his unwavering belief in him. He spoke of the countless sleepless nights and the sheer force of will it took to get the project over the line. He was telling her story, but he had cast himself as the hero. And then he delivered the final, cruelest twist. He looked out into the crowd, a soft, sentimental look in his eyes. "You can't achieve something like this without an anchor in your personal life. I have to thank my incredible partner in this journey." For one sickening heartbeat, Alara thought he might, in some twisted way, acknowledge her. "Instead," he said, "my amazing fiancée, for her patience and support." He had not only stolen her work, he had erased her from his history, replacing her with a more convenient, domestically acceptable supporting character. The lie was so complete, so audacious, that it was perfect. The applause swelled again. No one questioned it. No one stood up. She looked at the faces of her team, the people who had seen her at her desk at midnight, the ones who had brought her questions that only she could answer. They saw her, they knew, and they looked away. Their silence was their verdict. It was the final betrayal. In that moment, surrounded by 100 celebrating colleagues, Ilara Vance had never been more alone. The noise of the party faded, and in its place, a cold, vast and terrifying silence began to grow. The day after the gala, the world had lost its color. Ilara woke up on her couch, still in her silk dress, the city outside her window, a muted canvas of gray concrete and gray sky. The shock from the night before had subsided, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache, the kind of emotional void that feels physical. She hadn't slept. Instead, her mind had spent the night replaying Marcus's speech, Liam's triumphant smile, and the averted eyes of her colleagues, searching for a single frame, a single piece of evidence that it was all a monstrous misunderstanding. The part of her that still believed in fairness, the part that was built on her grandfather's lessons of integrity, refused to accept the brutal simplicity of the truth. It had to be a mistake. And so, with a desperate, fragile resolve, she showered, put on the most severe, professional suit she owned, and went to the office to demand an explanation. The atmosphere at Archstone had shifted overnight. The air, usually buzzing with competitive energy, was now thick with whispers and awkward silence. As she walked to her desk, conversations died. People who once greeted her with a cheerful good morning now seemed intensely fascinated by their computer screens. She was no longer a colleague, she was a ghost, a cautionary tale. She emailed Marcus, her request for a meeting direct and devoid of emotion. He made her wait for 3 hours, a petty power play designed to dismantle what little composure she had left. When his assistant finally summoned her, the walk to his corner office felt like a mile. He was on the phone when she entered, and he held up a single finger, forcing her to stand and wait in the center of the room like a disobedient child. When he finally hung up, the warm, paternal mask he usually wore was gone. His face was a sheet of cool, corporate indifference. "Marcus," she began, her voice steadier than she expected. "About last night. I don't understand. The partnership. You and I talked about it for months. You promised me." Marcus leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. "A promise, Alara? I make promises to motivate my staff. It's a tool. Frankly, I'm disappointed in your reaction. You're acting as if the team's victory is your personal defeat. That's not what a partner does. The gaslighting was so sudden, so complete, it took her breath away. The team? She managed to say. Marcus, I was the team. It was my work. He scoffed, a small, dismissive sound. Your work was the analysis, the number crunching. It was excellent, as always. But Liam managed the client. He managed the politics. He showed leadership. You, on the other hand, seem to think that hiding behind a spreadsheet is the same as leading a charge. The partnership was never a guarantee. It was a test. And your behavior right now is proving why you failed. He had twisted her dedication into a weakness, her focus into a flaw. She was being punished not for her failure, but for the very success he had exploited. She left his office utterly defeated, but the execution was not yet complete. A predator does not just abandon its prey, it ensures it can never threaten it again. While Alara was reeling, Marcus and Liam were setting their trap. Liam, in his new role as partner, initiated a standard review of past projects handled by his team. It was, of course, a targeted witch hunt. He spent the day digging through years of Alara's old files until he found what he was looking for: a minor, insignificant forecasting error in a preliminary report for a client from 2 years prior. The error had been caught and corrected by Alara herself within days and had zero impact on the project's outcome. But in the hands of Marcus and Liam, this tiny mistake became a weapon of mass destruction. They crafted a paper trail, a series of backdated emails and memos expressing grave concern over Alara's lack of attention to detail and the catastrophic risk her negligence had posed to the firm. It was a complete fabrication, a masterpiece of corporate fiction designed for one purpose: to justify her termination. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, the email arrived. The subject line was chillingly bland: meeting request. The body was a single sentence: Alara, please join myself and Marcus in conference room 4 immediately. She walked into the sterile, windowless room to find Marcus and the head of human resources, a woman named Cynthia, whose smile never quite reached her eyes. The file containing her professional death sentence was already open on the table between them. There was no discussion, no investigation. Cynthia read from a prepared statement, her voice a monotone drone of corporate jargon. Following a review of performance and a recent discovery of significant errors in client-facing materials, a decision has been made to terminate your employment with Archstone Consulting, effective immediately. Marcus sat beside her, his face a mask of feigned regret. Alara didn't speak. She looked at the documents, at the highlighted error, and she finally understood. This wasn't about a mistake. This was about silence. This was an assassination. The final indignity was the walk of shame. She was informed that for security reasons, she would have to pack her personal belongings and be escorted from the building. A stoic security guard followed her back to her desk. The entire floor went silent, the frantic clicking of keyboards stopping as everyone watched the grim procession. She moved in a daze, placing a photo of her grandfather, a well-worn copy of a history book he'd given her, and a small, chipped coffee mug into a brown cardboard box. These were the artifacts of a life that no longer existed. On her way out, she passed Liam's desk. He was staring intently at his monitor, his fingers flying across the keyboard, the very picture of a man too important to be disturbed. He didn't look up, he didn't flinch. He simply erased her from his line of sight, just as he had erased her from her own masterpiece. The elevator doors slid shut, and the last thing she saw was the gleaming, indifferent Archstone logo. A moment later, she was standing on the pavement of a busy Manhattan street, clutching a box of her broken life, a casualty of a war she never even knew she was fighting. She had hit the bottom. There was nowhere left to go but up, but the person who would eventually rise would be someone the old Alara Vance would never have recognized. The weeks that followed her termination were a blur of gray. Alara's world, once a sprawling map of ambition and strategic possibilities, had shrunk to the 4 walls of her small apartment. The curtains remained drawn, casting the rooms in a perpetual twilight that mirrored the state of her soul. Time lost its meaning, measured only by the changing patterns of light that filtered through the cheap fabric. Her phone buzzed with calls from her parents and concerned friends, but she let them all go to voicemail, the act of speaking an insurmountable effort. The city, with its relentless symphony of sirens and horns, became a monster outside her door, a constant reminder of the life she had lost. She was adrift in a silent, suffocating ocean of despair, replaying the betrayal on an endless loop, each viewing a fresh torment. It wasn't just the job or the money, it was the shattering of her entire belief system. The compass her grandfather had helped her build, the one that pointed steadfastly toward integrity and hard work, had been ripped from her hands, leaving her spinning in a moral void. Then came the blow that broke through the numbness. A phone call from her mother, her voice strained and thin, delivered the news that Arthur Vance, her grandfather, had passed away peacefully in his sleep. The news didn't register at first, an abstract fact that her mind, already so bruised, couldn't absorb. But as the reality settled, the floor fell away completely. The one person in her life who was a bastion of quiet strength, of unwavering principle, was gone. Her anchor was gone. She attended the funeral in a daze, a ghost at her own family's gathering. The kind words spoken about her grandfather, about his love for history and his gentle wisdom, felt like they were about a man from another lifetime. The person she was now felt unworthy of his legacy, a failure he would never have to witness. The grief was a heavy, suffocating blanket, smothering the last embers of her old self. She returned to her apartment in New York and sank even deeper into the abyss, utterly alone, untethered, and lost. Weeks turned into a month. A stack of condolence cards and final notice bills lay unopened by the door. She was simply existing, a vessel hollowed out by grief and injustice. It was then that a letter arrived that was too formal to ignore. It was embossed with the name of a prestigious Manhattan law firm, Sterling, Cromwell, and Finch. The letter was a formal request for her presence at the reading of the last will and testament of her grandfather. Ilara was baffled. Her grandfather was a humble history teacher who lived in a modest house filled with books, not a man who retained a high-powered Wall Street law firm. She assumed it was a mistake, or some dry legal formality regarding the sale of his house. A sense of duty, the last remaining thread connecting her to the man he was, compelled her to make the appointment. She put on a clean black dress, the only color that felt appropriate for her world, and took the subway to an address in a part of town she had only ever seen in movies. The offices of Sterling, Cromwell, and Finch were a world away from her grandfather's dusty, comfortable study. They were a hushed sanctuary of old money, all dark mahogany, oriental rugs, and the faint smell of leather and polish. From the window of the waiting room, she could see Central Park sprawling below. She was met by a Mr. Alistair Sterling himself, a man in his late 60s with a kind but serious face. He led her into his office, offered his condolences with genuine warmth, and then got straight to the point. "Miss Vance," he began, his voice calm and measured, "what you knew of your grandfather's life was entirely true. He was a dedicated teacher, a scholar, and a man of profound integrity. However, it was not the complete picture." He went on to explain that her great-grandfather, a man Arthur rarely spoke of, had been an engineer and an inventor. In the post-war boom of the 1950 seconds, he had partnered with two other men to start a small technology and manufacturing conglomerate. It was a risky venture, but it had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. That company was called Omnicorp. Ilara stared at him, confused. "My grandfather never mentioned this." Sterling nodded. He had no interest in the world of business. When his father passed, Arthur inherited his 1/3 stake in the company. His partners begged him to take an active role, but he refused. He wanted a life of the mind, so he made a simple deal. He would remain a completely silent partner, his name scrubbed from all public records, and in exchange, he would never interfere. He lived off a modest stipend, and for 50 years, his shares, his dividends, everything just accumulated. "Mr." Sterling slid a thick, leather-bound portfolio across the vast desk. "Your grandfather's will is very simple, Miss Vance. He has left his entire estate to you. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. This includes his house, his book collection, and his 57% controlling interest in the Omnicorp global enterprise. The words didn't compute. They were just sounds, disconnected from reality. 57%, controlling interest. Omnicorp. Her mind was a static hum. She numbly opened the portfolio. Inside were stock certificates of almost mythological value and complex shareholder agreements. And then, on the last page, there was a corporate structure chart. At the very top, in a bold, imposing box, was the Omnicorp logo. Branching down from it were dozens of other boxes representing its vast holdings in technology, manufacturing, and real estate. And near the bottom of the page, listed as a wholly owned subsidiary, was a name that made the air leave her lungs in a sudden, sharp gasp: Archstone Consulting. She looked at the name, the clean, corporate font that had signed her termination letter. She looked at the chart that showed it was just a tiny, insignificant cog in a machine she now commanded. The shock was a physical jolt, an electric current that shot through her exhausted body. The grief and the despair didn't vanish, but they were instantly transmuted, crystallized into something hard, cold, and clear: a purpose. Her grandfather, the quiet historian, had not just left her a fortune. He had left her an empire. He had left her a weapon. He had given her a ghost's legacy. Standing up, Alara walked to the window and looked down at the city. It was no longer a monster. It was a chessboard. And for the first time in a very, very long time, she knew exactly what her next move would be. The woman who left the lawyer's office was not the same one who had entered. The grief for her grandfather was still a palpable weight in her chest, but it had changed its nature. It was no longer the hollow, paralyzing sorrow of loss. It had become the solid, heavy mass of legacy. In her hands, she held not just unimaginable wealth, but a responsibility. Her grandfather, the quiet historian, had spent his life studying the rise and fall of empires, the consequences of hubris, and the slow, inexorable march of justice. He had never participated, but he had watched, and he had understood. And in his final act, he had not left her a fortune to comfort her. He had left her an arsenal to right a wrong. The naivete that had defined Alara Vance for so long did not survive the walk back to her apartment. It had been burned away by the stunning, terrible clarity of her new reality. Her apartment, once a prison of despair, transformed into a monastery of purpose, a war room disguised by its modest exterior. The first thing she did was take the cardboard box from her old office, the one containing the sad relics of her former life, and seal it shut with packing tape. She didn't throw it away. She carried it down to the storage locker in the basement of her building and left it in the dark, a symbolic burial of the woman who was too willing to trade her brilliance for a word of praise. The old Alara, the one who believed in meritocracy and hoped for fairness, was now an ancestor, a ghost to be learned from but never to be resurrected. In her place, a new Alara began to emerge. This version was colder, quieter, and infinitely more dangerous. The fire of her ambition, which had once burned brightly to create and build, now smoldered with a different kind of heat, the focused blue flame of deconstruction. For the next 6 months, she disappeared from the world. She did not buy a penthouse or a new wardrobe. She did not indulge in any of the trappings of her new wealth. Instead, she embarked on the most intense project of her life, her own education. The curriculum was vengeance. Her living room, once a place of rest, became a library of corporate warfare. Stacks of books on hostile takeovers, forensic accounting, and corporate law replaced novels and magazines. The whiteboards that had once held the complex architecture of Project Chimera were now covered in a different kind of blueprint. The command structure of Omnicorp, the intricate web of its finances, and a detailed psychological profile of every key player at Archstone Consulting. She worked with the ferocity she had once applied to her job, but this time, the client was justice. Her nights were spent in video conferences with Alistair Sterling and his team of ruthless corporate lawyers who became her private tutors. They taught her how to read the fine print in a shareholder agreement, how to leverage a minority stake, and how to wield the immense power of a board of directors. Her first strategic decision was to remain a ghost. A public return as Ilara Vance, the wronged heiress, would be a dramatic story for the newspapers, but it would be emotionally messy and strategically foolish. It would make her the focus. She needed her target to be the focus. So, with Sterling's help, she created her weapon. They established a new entity, a private equity firm with a name that was deliberately elegant and opaque, Viridian Holdings. The name sounded like money, like growth, like something ancient and powerful. It was a perfect corporate phantom. Sterling's lawyers wrapped its ownership in a labyrinth of international trusts and holding companies, a structure so complex that tracing it back to a small apartment in New York would be impossible. Viridian Holdings had no public face, no celebrity CEO. Its only identity was its immense, untraceable capital and its sudden, aggressive interest in the internal governance of Omnicorp's subsidiaries. While the lawyers built the weapon, Ilara loaded it, with ammunition drawn from the vaults of her own memory. This was her singular, devastating advantage. She didn't need a whistleblower or an inside source. She was the inside source. She knew every dirty secret at Archstone because she had been the one tasked with cleaning them up or covering them over. She remembered the dangerously over-leveraged real estate deal Marcus had pushed through against the advice of his risk management team. She knew which project accounts had their profits artificially inflated at the end of every quarter to meet bonus targets, because she was the one who had to build the models to justify the numbers. She knew the senior managers who despised Marcus for passing them over for promotions. Most of all, she knew her primary targets. She knew Marcus's ego was his Achilles heel. He could not fathom being outsmarted, especially by someone he considered his inferior. And she knew Liam's crippling insecurity was his. He was a hollow man, terrified of being exposed, and under pressure, he would do anything to save himself. Her plan, when it was finally complete, was not a frontal assault. It was a slow, deliberate, and exquisitely cruel infection. She would not simply fire them. That was a mercy they did not deserve. She would dismantle their careers, their reputations, and their partnership, piece by piece, using the very rules of the corporate game they revered. She would use their own ambition, their own greed, and their own treachery as the instruments of their downfall. By the end of 6 months, the transformation was complete. The grief for her grandfather had been forged into a diamond-hard resolve. The woman who had been broken by an unjust system now controlled it. She sat in her quiet apartment, the city lights twinkling outside her window, and picked up the phone. She dialed a single number. "Alistair," she said, her voice calm, clear, and utterly devoid of its former warmth. "It's time. Instruct the board of Omnicorp to initiate a full, top-to-bottom forensic audit of Archstone Consulting. Cite anonymous shareholder concerns over financial irregularities." The architect had finished her blueprints. Construction was about to begin. The first tremor of the coming earthquake arrived not as a shout, but as a whisper, a single, sterile email that landed in Marcus Thorne's inbox with the digital weight of a tombstone. It came from the office of the chairman of Omnicorp, a man Marcus had only met twice. The language was cold, precise, and brutally efficient. Effective immediately, Archstone Consulting would be subject to a full-scope, unscheduled forensic audit. The audit would be conducted by a firm named Viridian Holdings, an entity described only as representing a highly influential shareholder consortium with significant concerns regarding financial irregularities and project management protocols. Marcus read the email twice, his initial annoyance curdling into a knot of unease in his stomach. This was not a routine checkup, this was an invasion. He immediately summoned Liam to his office. Liam, who had been enjoying the spoils of his new partnership, read the email, and his face went pale. "What does this mean?" he stammered. "Who is Viridian?" Marcus, projecting a confidence he did not feel, waved a dismissive hand. "It's nothing. Corporate overreach. Some bean counters on the parent company's board trying to justify their existence. We'll give them our files, they'll find nothing, and they'll be gone in a week. Just make sure the Chimera files are pristine." But even as he said it, a cold dread began to seep into the edges of his confidence. The name Viridian Holdings was a blank slate, and in the corporate world, Nothing is more terrifying than an unknown power. The following Monday, they arrived. A team of 5 auditors, dressed in identical, severely tailored dark suits, walked into the archstone lobby with the silent, purposeful air of federal agents. They didn't speak to the receptionist. They simply stood in the center of the gleaming marble floor, their presence immediately sucking the air out of the room. The usual morning buzz of the office died down to a nervous hum. And then, the lobby doors opened again, and a 6th figure entered, walking past the team to stand at its head. It was a woman. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe, elegant chignon. She wore a bespoke charcoal gray suit that radiated quiet, expensive authority. Her posture was impeccable, her face a mask of detached neutrality. As she turned her head to survey the office, a collective, unspoken gasp seemed to ripple through the employees who saw her. It was Ilara Vance, but it was not. It was a stranger wearing her face, an uncanny, terrifying echo of the woman they had cast out months ago. The hesitant, slightly stooped posture was gone, replaced by a spine of steel. The hopeful, eager to please light in her eyes had been extinguished, and in its place was a cold, analytical intelligence that seemed to see everything and reveal nothing. Marcus and Liam were summoned to the main boardroom. They walked in, attempting to project an air of calm authority, an illusion that shattered the moment they saw her standing at the head of the long, polished table. Marcus froze mid-stride, his carefully constructed smile faltering for a fraction of a second. Liam stopped dead, his face draining of all color. He looked as if he had just seen a ghost, which, in a way, he had. Ilara did not smile. She did not offer a handshake. She simply watched them approach, her gaze level and unnervingly direct. "Good morning, Mr. Thorne, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice the same, yet entirely different. It was stripped of all its former warmth, leaving only a crisp, clear, and chillingly impersonal tone. "I am Ilara Vance, lead consultant for Viridian Holdings. We are here to conduct a full forensic audit of this subsidiary on behalf of Omnicorp shareholders. Please, have a seat." The use of her own name was a stroke of tactical genius. It was not an alias. It was an accusation. It told them that she was not hiding, that she wanted them to know exactly who was orchestrating their torment. The blood rushed to Marcus's face. He was trapped. This woman, his former, discarded employee, was now before him, cloaked in an impenetrable armor of corporate power he could not understand, and he was forced to sit and listen to her like a subordinate. Ilara took her seat and opened a sleek, silver laptop. "My team and I will require full, unrestricted access to all company servers, email archives, financial records, and personnel files. Effective immediately," she stated, not as a request, but as a fact. "Any attempts to delay, obstruct, or otherwise impede this audit will be noted and reported directly to the Omnicorp board." She looked up, her eyes meeting Marcus's for a brief, electric moment. Then she delivered her first, precisely aimed strike. "We will begin with a deep dive into the most significant project of the last fiscal year. Please have every document, every email, every invoice, and every financial model related to Project Chimera delivered to our designated workspace within the hour." She had named their crowning achievement, the very project that was the foundation of Liam's partnership and Marcus's bonus. She had turned their monument into a crime scene. After a few more clipped, professional instructions, she dismissed them. "We will be in touch if we require your personal input. Thank you for your cooperation." Marcus and Liam walked out of the boardroom in a stunned silence. The power dynamic of the entire company had just been rewritten in the space of 10 minutes. The news of Ilara's return spread through the office like a contagion of fear. She and her team took over the largest glass-walled conference room, turning it into their impenetrable headquarters. They worked with a silent, terrifying efficiency, their faces illuminated by the glow of their laptops. Ilara became a phantom of judgment, occasionally seen walking the halls with a tablet in her hand, her expression unreadable. She didn't speak to her former colleagues. She didn't have to. Her presence alone was a suffocating psychological pressure, a constant reminder to every person who had stayed silent, to every person who had looked away, that a debt was being called in. The ghost was no longer haunting the shadows. She had taken her seat at the table, and the reckoning had just begun. Alara's revenge was not a raging fire. It was a glacier, a slow, silent, and unstoppable force of nature, grinding down everything in its path. From her new headquarters in the glass-walled conference room, she began her work not with aggression, but with the quiet, methodical precision of a master surgeon. She didn't need to search for the rot within Archstone. She already had the map. Her first target was the money. She remembered the strange, recurring invoices she had been forced to process for a mysterious consulting firm called Vanguard Strategic Solutions. The invoices were always vague, for synergy consulting or strategic advisory, and they were always personally approved by Liam, with a quick note saying Marcus had signed off. At the time, she had flagged them as unusual, but was told to stand down. Now, she pulled on that thread. Within hours, her audit team, guided by her specific instructions, confirmed her suspicions. Vanguard Strategic Solutions was a shell corporation, a ghost entity that existed only as a post office box in Delaware. It had been receiving monthly six-figure payments from the Project Chimera budget for the last year, funds that were then funneled into an account that Marcus and Liam jointly controlled. It was blatant, arrogant embezzlement. Alara had her smoking gun, but a quick kill was not her objective. This was merely the first domino. With the hard evidence of fraud secured, she turned her attention to the human element, the silent witnesses to her professional execution. She began a series of one-on-one interviews with her former team members, scheduling them one by one in her sterile conference room. This was not an interrogation. It was a masterclass in psychological deconstruction. She never raised her voice. She never made accusations. She simply asked questions, armed with the perfect, unimpeachable knowledge of a creator, questioning those who had stolen her creation. She would slide a complex data model across the table to a junior analyst. "Mr. Chen," she'd ask, her tone one of mild academic curiosity, "I'm trying to understand the weighting of the variables in this algorithm. Can you please walk me through your rationale?" The analyst, who had only been given the finished product by Liam, would stammer, his eyes wide with panic, before finally admitting that he hadn't created the model. He had just run the numbers. She would nod slowly, make a note on her legal pad, and say, "Thank you, that clarifies things." She did this again and again. To the project manager, she would ask about the specific timeline of a key strategic pivot, a pivot she had conceived at 3 in the morning after a week of intense work. To the graphic designer, she would inquire about the origin of a specific conceptual diagram she had sketched on a napkin. Each question was a key, unlocking a door that revealed the truth. She wasn't asking them to betray their boss. She was simply forcing them to admit their own ignorance, and in doing so, to implicitly confess who the true architect had been. The loyalty Marcus commanded, which was built on fear, began to crumble under the weight of her calm, factual pressure. With the foundation of their lie disintegrating, Alara set the final, most elegant trap. She understood that the bond between two serpents is not trust, but mutual convenience. To destroy them, she only needed to make them believe that their convenience had expired. She orchestrated a calculated leak. During a brief walk to the coffee machine, she held a hushed, intentionally audible phone call with one of her lawyers, making sure a known office gossip was within earshot. She used carefully chosen words. "No, the Chimera fraud is just the entry point. The board is more concerned with Marcus's historical dealings, specifically a project from 2021. I believe it was called Aegis. Yes, we'll need to subpoena his personal financial records." Project Aegis was a name she had pulled from an old, obscure file, a project known to be one of Marcus's solo ventures long before Liam's rise. The gossip did his work, and within an hour, the rumor had slithered through the entire office and landed squarely on Liam Carter's desk. The audit was no longer about Chimera. It was a full-blown investigation into Marcus Thorne, and Viridian was digging into things that had happened years ago. The bait was taken. Panic seized Liam. His self-preservation instinct, the very trait that had enabled his betrayal, went into overdrive. He saw the future with perfect clarity. Marcus, the master survivor, would offer up a sacrifice to save himself, and Liam, the newly minted, disposable partner, was the obvious choice. His loyalty to Marcus evaporated instantly. That evening, long after the office had cleared out, Liam was at his desk, but he wasn't working. He was committing treason. With sweat beading on his forehead, he frantically searched through old email servers and archived files, downloading every incriminating document he could find on Marcus, anything that would distance himself from the Chimera fraud and prove he was merely following orders. He copied files to a hidden USB drive. He even attempted to secretly record a phone call with Marcus, trying to bait him into admitting he was the mastermind. The very tools of deceit and subterfuge he had used to climb the ladder were now being used to saw off the rung above him. From her conference room, Ilara watched them. She saw the new, furtive way they spoke to each other, the paranoid glances, the hushed, angry conversations behind closed office doors. She couldn't hear their words, but she didn't need to. She had written the script of their mutual destruction. The two men who had stood united on a stage, celebrating a stolen victory, were now trapped in a cage of her design, circling each other, their fangs bared. She had the financial evidence. She had broken their witnesses. And now, the villains of her story had begun to devour each other. The deconstruction was nearly complete. All that remained was to pull down the walls. The reckoning took place on a Tuesday in the cavernous, wood-paneled boardroom on the 80th floor of the Omnicorp Tower. It was a room designed to intimidate, with a single, colossal mahogany table that felt more like an altar of judgment. At the far end of this altar sat Marcus Thorne and Liam Carter. They had spent the past week preparing for this moment, rehearsing a narrative of injured innocence and corporate success. They believed this was a battle of words, a game of persuasion they were masters at playing. They had come prepared with a presentation full of soaring profit charts and glowing client testimonials, ready to paint Ilara as a bitter, disgruntled employee and the Viridian audit as a baseless witch hunt. They saw themselves as lions, summoned to explain their roar to a council of old, sleepy sheep. They had no idea they had been led into a steel trap. The board of Omnicorp was anything but sleepy. They were a tribunal of silent, stony-faced men and women who had seen and survived generations of corporate warfare. The chairman, a formidable man named Franklin Croft, began the proceedings with a voice like cracking granite. "Mr. Thorne, this board has reviewed the preliminary findings of the audit. They are, to say the least, troubling. The floor is yours to offer an explanation." Marcus stood, adjusting his tie, the picture of confidence. He launched into the performance of his life, his voice smooth and reassuring. He spoke of Archstone's unprecedented success, of the triumph of Project Chimera, and of the unblemished records of his leadership team. He dismissed the financial flags as aggressive but perfectly legal accounting practices and framed the entire audit as a disruptive and unnecessary inquisition, likely prompted by a malicious, unfounded complaint from a former, underperforming employee. He was charming, arrogant, and utterly convincing to anyone who did not know the truth. Liam nodded along, playing the part of the loyal, wronged lieutenant. When Marcus finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Chairman Croft looked at him, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne. Now, we will hear from the lead consultant of Viridian Holdings." Ilara rose from her seat beside the chairman. She did not walk to a podium. She simply stood at her place, a tablet in her hand. She was not a performer. She was a prosecutor. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Members of the board," she began, her voice a calm, clinical instrument. "My findings are not a matter of opinion or interpretation. They are a matter of record." She started with the fraud. On the massive screen at the end of the room, she didn't just project a few suspicious invoices. She projected a live, animated flowchart that showed the irrefutable path of the money, from the Archstone project account to the Delaware PO, box of the Vanguard Shell Company, and finally landing in a shared, undeclared offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Bank statements, wire transfers, account numbers, it was all there. Gasps could be heard from around the table. Marcus's confident smirk vanished. Next, she dismantled the lie of their competence. Mr. Thorne and Mr. Carter have positioned themselves as the architects of Project Chimera, she stated. The project's own digital archaeology tells a different story. She displayed side-by-side comparisons of documents, her original time-stamped strategy memos from her old Archstone computer next to the final reports Liam had submitted under his name, showing entire paragraphs copied verbatim. She then played short, anonymized audio clips from her interviews with the team, their voices hesitant and fearful. "I wasn't involved in the conceptual phase. That was all Miss Vance," one voice said. "I was just given the finished model and told to run the numbers," said another. She was not just claiming credit, she was presenting the notarized birth certificate of her work. Liam Carter began to shrink in his chair, his face slick with a cold sweat. Then, Alara delivered the killing blow, the move designed to turn them on each other. "What's most concerning," she continued, her eyes briefly flicking toward Liam, "is the apparent breakdown of trust within Archstone's leadership." She paused. "During the course of our investigation, Mr. Carter provided us, perhaps inadvertently, with evidence of his own." On the screen, she projected an email Liam had sent from his personal account to his lawyer, with the subject line, "Leverage." Attached was a file. She played it. It was the audio of the phone call Liam had secretly recorded, the one where he tried to bait Marcus into admitting he was the mastermind. The board heard Marcus's arrogant, dismissive voice. "The board only cares about the result." That's how the game is played. The public humiliation was absolute. The two men stared at each other down the long table, their pretense of unity shattered, their faces a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. Marcus lunged to his feet. "This is absurd. He was responsible for the budget. Every invoice crossed his desk." Liam, finding his voice, shot back, his words tumbling out in a panicked rush. "He told me to do it. He said it was standard practice. He set me up to take the fall." Their pathetic, snarling accusations echoed in the silent, dignified room, the final, ugly death rattle of their careers. "Enough." The chairman's voice was a crack of thunder, silencing them instantly. He let them stand there, panting and exposed, their dignity in tatters. He surveyed the scene with disgust. Then his gaze shifted, moving past them, past the other board members, and settling entirely on Alara. His entire demeanor softened from one of judgment to one of profound deference. He looked at the woman who had orchestrated this flawless corporate execution. "The findings of this audit are clear and deeply disturbing. The board will take immediate action to remove Mr. Thorne and Mr. Thorne Carter and begin legal proceedings." He paused, letting the verdict hang in the air. "However," he continued, his voice now quiet and directed only at her, "given the unique circumstances and the controlling interest you represent, Miss Vance, as the majority shareholder of this corporation, the final directive is yours. What would you have us do?" Time itself seemed to stop. The blood drained from Marcus's face as his mind struggled to comprehend the words, "majority shareholder." Liam looked back and forth between the chairman and Alara, a silent scream forming on his lips. They hadn't just been outmaneuvered by a consultant. They hadn't just been exposed by an ex-employee. They had been sitting here, pleading their case to the mercy of the very woman they had destroyed, a woman who, it turned out, was not a pawn in their game, but the owner of the entire board. Ilara stood in the silence, her expression unreadable. She looked down the long table at the two broken, terrified men who had stolen her life's work and cast her out into the darkness. Her own journey, from the depths of despair to this moment of absolute power, flashed before her eyes. The architect had completed her masterpiece of retribution, and now it was time to sign her name. In the suffocating silence of the Omnicorp boardroom, every eye was fixed on Alara. The two men who had been her tormentors now stood before her as prisoners awaiting their sentence, their arrogance finally and completely shattered. The power they had worshipped, the corporate authority they had wielded like a weapon, was now hers to command. She looked at Marcus, then at Liam, her expression not of hatred, but of a profound and finality. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm and clear, each word a perfectly placed stone in the foundation of her new world. "Mr. Chairman," she said, addressing Franklin Croft, but never taking her eyes off the two broken men. "My directive is simple. Terminate their employment, effective immediately. Claw back every bonus, every stock option, and every dollar of compensation tied to the success of Project Chimera. And finally," she paused, delivering the final, inescapable consequence: "Instruct our corporate counsel to cooperate fully with the district attorney's office regarding their financial misconduct." It was not a fiery speech. It was an execution order, delivered with the dispassionate precision of a surgeon. The verdict was absolute. Before Marcus or Liam could even process the words, two security guards entered the room, their presence a silent, final statement. The Lions of Archstone were escorted out, stripped of their titles, their fortunes, and their futures, their pathetic protests swallowed by the closing of the heavy boardroom doors. The days that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and corporate restructuring, but Alara's final task was a personal one. She flew back to her grandfather's house, the quiet, book-filled home that had always been her sanctuary. It was time to go through his belongings. In his study, surrounded by the comforting scent of old paper and leather, she found a small, locked wooden box. The key was exactly where she knew it would be, tucked inside a hollowed-out copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. Inside the box, beneath old family photographs and a pair of worn reading glasses, was a single thick envelope. On the front, in his familiar, elegant script, was her name. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The letter was dated 6 months before his death, written just after the week she had called him, her voice thick with exhaustion, to say she wouldn't be able to visit because of the final push on a project she couldn't talk about. "My dearest Alara," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means I have left you with a burden that is also a key. I am a student of history, and I have always known that the most important battles are often fought, not on fields of war, but in the quiet corridors of power. I have heard the unspoken battles in your voice these past few years. I heard the pride you took in your work, but I also heard it being slowly eroded by the exhaustion, the frustration, the quiet injustice of a system that values applause more than architecture. I could not interfere. It was not my place. But I could ensure that when the time was right, you would have the tools not just to defend yourself, but to reshape the battlefield itself. The shares, the wealth, the power, they are not a gift for a life of comfort. They are a legacy of responsibility. I did not leave you wealth to live a life of ease. I left you power to rebuild a world you believe in. Justice is not something you wait for. It is something you build, brick by painful brick. You, my dear, have always been its architect." Tears streamed down Alara's face, but they were not tears of grief. They were tears of profound, aching clarity. Her meticulously planned revenge was not just her own creation. It was the final lesson from her greatest teacher, a posthumous collaboration to prove that history does, in fact, remember the builders. Her quest for justice was the fulfillment of his legacy. A week later, Alara Vance stood on the very same stage at Archstone Consulting, where she had been publicly humiliated months before. She looked out at the sea of anxious, uncertain faces. She did not speak of the past, of betrayal, or of revenge. She spoke only of the future. "The old way of doing business at this firm is over," she said, her voice echoing with a quiet, unshakable authority. "From this day forward, we will be a company built on a single, simple principle. The work speaks for itself, and we will learn to listen. Credit will be given where it is due. Integrity will be our most valuable asset, and brilliance, in all its forms, will be our only currency." And so, the architect began to build. She didn't just clean house, she renovated it from the foundation up, transforming a toxic jungle into a place where talent could flourish without fear. The story of what happened became a quiet legend, a corporate ghost story whispered in the gleaming towers of Manhattan. It served as a potent, chilling reminder. Never, ever underestimate the silence of a person who has endured too much. For in that silence, they are not breaking down. They are drawing blueprints. They are gathering their tools, sharpening their resolve, and waiting for the precise moment to reveal the devastating and beautiful masterpiece of their own justice. Thank you for listening. Join us next time for another story from behind the closed doors of the corporate world.